This is the amazing survival story of Federal Express Flight 705. It was a normal Thursday afternoon on April 7, 1994, and Federal Express Flight 705 was scheduled to departure from Memphis, Tennessee to San Jose, California. Among the crew members were Captain David Sanders, co-pilot James Tucker, and flight engineer Andrew Peterson. When they arrived at the plane, there was another person already there. His name was Auburn Calloway, who was another flight engineer, and he was off duty and was heading as a passenger to California. They introduced each other and then went to do the pre-flight check, and Peterson noticed that a circuit break had been pulled, which would cut power to the cockpit voice recorder. He didn't think much of it. He just pulled it back in and continued his pre-flight checks, and then they departed from Memphis a little bit after 3. The takeoff was completely uneventful, and for about 20 minutes the flight was completely normal. Then Calloway, who had been sitting just outside the cockpit, stood up, grabbed something from his guitar case, and entered the cockpit. And without any warning, he struck Peterson several times in his head with a hammer. Then he just turned around and did the same to Tucker. The crew was completely caught off guard. Calloway continued his attack, and then he turned towards Captain Sanders, who realized what was happening and he had time to react, but he was also struck several times. At that moment, Calloway took the time to retrieve a loaded spear gun from outside the cockpit. As he re-entered the cockpit, he pointed the spear gun at them and he screamed, "Sit down! This is a real gun, and I'll kill you." Barely able to process what was happening, the crew knew that they had to do something or they will all die. Bleeding profusely and struggling to maintain balance, Peterson, who was close to Calloway, saw the opportunity to grab the spear gun. Sanders just jumped out of his seat and they began to struggle to try to disarm Calloway, who kept attacking them as they fought back. Meanwhile, Tucker, who was a former Navy pilot and was partially paralyzed by the attack, tried to help in the only way he could, by using the plane itself. He put the plane into a sudden climb, which pushed Calloway and the crew out of the cockpit as they fought. With no time to ready for help, Tucker kept maneuvering the plane as if it was a fighter jet. He rolled the plane to the side, throwing everybody off balance. Sanders and Peterson continued to fight, trying to wrestle the hammer and the spear away from Calloway's hand. Tucker then rolled the plane almost completely upside down, turning the fight into a literal battle on the ceiling of the plane. Calloway was still trying to free himself while Sanders and Peterson used whatever strength they had left to subdue him while suffering from severe pain and extensive blood loss. At one point, Tucker even put the plane into a steep dive, anything to give his co-workers a fighting chance. It was a miracle that this plane didn't fall apart. You have to understand this was a very big plane. Just to give you an idea, when used as a passenger plane, this DC-10 can hold anywhere between 250 to 350 passengers. It was definitely not designed for the kind of maneuver it was being put through. This fight was brutal. You can hear in the voice recorder, at one time they were beaten, they were scratched, and they were hit in the head multiple times. Thankfully, Sanders managed to wrestle the hammer away from Calloway's hand, and he struck back, knowing that they needed to stop this fight or they wouldn't have enough strength to continue. Tucker was finally able to contact air traffic control, but you can hear in his voice and his breathing he was having a very hard time. He said,
Express 705, not been wounded. Lieutenant, attempted takeover on board the airplane. Give me a vector, please. Back to Memphis at this time. Hurry.
Sanders and Peterson held Calloway down, and Tucker, despite being partially paralyzed, set the airplane in autopilot and went to help however he could. The Sander, who is the pilot, returned to the cockpit, taking with him any weapons he found on the way to prevent Calloway from taking them back. Bleeding and disoriented, he sat at the pilot's seats and took over the controls and headed for the airport. He said,
Okay, we need an ambulance and we need armed intervention as well.
On the ground, ambulance and officers were preparing to assist. In the air, Sanders was worried because the plane was too heavy with cargo and fuel, and he couldn't dump the fuel because he couldn't reach the controls, and everybody else was fighting.
Press 705, did you verify situation still under control?
Well, it's sort of under control.
Sander continued to fly toward the airport, but then realized he was flying too fast and too high to be able to land on runway 9. Therefore, he requested to use runway 36 left, which is longer.
I'm coming around to 36 left.
But to do so, he had to take a very sharp turn. He tilted the plane almost all the way to his side, and he had to take a very sharp U-turn to be able to align the plane with the runway. As you can imagine, the alarms inside the cockpit were going off, but Sander either couldn't hear them or chose to ignore them. Nevertheless, he managed to safely land the plane while they continued to struggle to restrain Calloway. Emergency crew finally boarded the plane just to find everything completely covered in blood. All the walls, the ceilings, the chairs, and 4 severely injured men inside. Calloway was handcuffed and all of them were quickly rushed to the hospital. During the investigation, it was discovered that Calloway, who was divorced and did not have custody of his children, was about to lose his job. In desperation, he planned to crash the plane to make his suicide appear as an accident so his family could collect the $2.5 million life insurance payout. He arranged all of his finance and updated his will before the flight, and he even left a note for his family. Calloway was scheduled to be the flight engineer on that flight. His original plan was to be done while he was working, meaning he only had to subdue the pilot and co-pilot. And there was a very good chance that he would have succeeded because he had to take over 2 instead of 3 people. However, he and his crew had exceeded their flying hours and were replaced by the current crew. When his schedule was changed, he just changed his plans too. Knowing he was scheduled for a disciplinary hearing the next day, where he most likely was going to be fired because he had lied about his flight experience. So he packed his guitar case with 4 hammers, a spear gun, and a knife. These weapons will cause damage similar to those of a crash because he didn't want to raise any suspicions, and pretended to head to California and attack this crew instead. Unknown to Calloway, 2 of these crew members were US veterans, and all 3 of them were ready to put up a fight. In the end, Sanders suffered deep gashes in his head, and his right ear was almost completely detached. Peterson had a skull fracture and damage to his temporal artery, which nearly caused him to bleed to death. Tucker sustained a severe skull fracture that left him unable to control the right side of his body. His jaw was dislocated and he had multiple cuts because Calloway tried to gouge out one of his eyes. The aircraft was also damaged by all the maneuvers it was put through and required repairs that cost around $800,000 at that time. Some of these crew members had to have multiple surgeries and a very long rehab to be able to recover. Sadly, none of the crew members were medically cleared to fly commercially again. Calloway was charged with air piracy and interference with flight operation and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated in a penitentiary in Coleman, Florida. Tell me what you think about this story. What could we have done to prevent this situation? I think nowadays they check everybody, even the crew members, to prevent things like this happening.